We're now live on YouTube with the February 4th, 2019 meeting of the Joint Foundation Bootstrap Committee. We currently have 10 panelists on the call and one person dialed in. And we have a full agenda today, so I think we can jump right in. The first item on the agenda is issue number 90. We have a 10-minute time box for this. This is an issue that was opened by Jory about project-directed funding. Jory, do you want to introduce this issue?
Sure, Miles. I'm not sure that this even needs to take too much time because the issue was composed as a result of a conversation that we had last week at the meeting that kind of explored a lot of different implications, and one of them was project funding. We decided that we certainly needed to figure out a place and a time to address that. So the issue is simply capturing the concern, but it's not, at least as my memory serves from last week, and certainly my current sentiment is, this isn't something that needs to be addressed as a function of the merger, but rather something that probably needs to, field an exploratory committee on the topic and start to think of how this wants to be addressed with the CPC and the board.
I think there were a couple comments in the issue that it likely, like what we need to make sure is that the foundation has some allowance or whatever needs to go in the bylaws in order to allow this. We've got that part covered at least. So I don't know, I mean, that could be nothing, or that could be something if it's...
I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, from the other organizations that I've been a part of that have done this, it hasn't really had bylaws implication, but that's probably more of a question for Andy and Steve.
Yeah, this is Andy. I missed the front end of the question. Can you give that part to me again?
Sure, Andy. So the question basically is framed around, what might we want to do to provide avenues for projects to receive earmarked funding?
Yeah, there's no particular reason why that needs to be in the bylaws. There's lots of different models for doing that. It's more of an internal governance having to do with, typically the way it works out, typically it has more implication for, technical matters rather than governance. We could, if you wanted to, it could go in ways where that would be appropriate. So for example, if you look at the Linux Foundation, all these scores of projects that are within the Linux Foundation, most of them have their own funding and their own governing body. So sometimes when you do earmarked funds within an organization, there's a level of governance that that associates itself with the dedicated funds. So depending upon what people wanted, that might back into the bylaws, or it might be handled just fine through a working group charter. So I'd start with the assumption it probably isn't going to impact the bylaws, but until you know exactly what you want to do, you can't rule it out entirely.
I guess from your perspective, is it something that you think we can leave until later, or that we should?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Yeah. Okay, that's the key question.
Yeah, there's another key point in this, which is bylaws are not fundamentally mutable. We have to get to a good solid base, and then we can adjust them if we need to.
Sure.
Yeah, I think based on that, it seems like a reasonable thing for us to evaluate when we start working closer with the projects and figuring out the structure that we want and adapting the bylaws as necessary but things aren't set in stone.
Yeah, but I think Andy's right. I think others have done this without having anything in their bylaws as a result. So I'd be hesitant to want to lock us into some kind of fixed structure when it's something we're going to want to experiment with.
I think that's very much like our attitude last week regarding the individual membership proposal, where we see a chance that is something that needs to go into the bylaws once we have a program and a pattern that really works. But we wouldn't want to make it so difficult to change and iterate on if we were experimenting. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, it's much easier to get agreement between all of the board members to vote for something if we know that it's a model that works.
Okay, so with that, we've got 4 minutes left, but I don't think we're going to need it. Does it seem reasonable then, Jory, to bring it back to the issue and kind of present that this is something the foundation should explore, but isn't necessary for the first iteration of the bylaws and potentially not necessary for the bylaws at all? And we should try to figure out a program that works.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Okay, excellent. So the next agenda item that we have is number 80, which is initial code of conduct wording. Michael, since you're the one who opened this, do you want to maybe give a quick introduction?
Sure. So this basically came out of a discussion, I think it's probably 2 weeks ago now. And we discussed a couple of different models in terms of, and I guess not necessarily different models, but different options in terms of pluses and minuses of having a single code of conduct for the foundation, allowing projects to have their own, as well as the concept of an escalation process. So this, I wrote down capturing the discussion that we had. There was, I'm just looking now that, as of 5 days ago, I'd addressed all the comments. There have been a few more comments since then, which I haven't seen because I think they just happened pretty much over the weekend. But, basically the model that's captured there is a single code of conduct, which projects are expected to adopt as they come into the project. I think there's like a grace period, as well as a COCP panel, which is the place where complaints can be escalated, but only after having, well, not necessarily only after, but the model is meant to be that projects can handle and have their own process. But if something needs to be escalated, there's a panel at the foundation level that would handle those escalations. And the CPC plays a similar role to the projects for spaces within the foundation as sort of the first place where those complaints are handled before they might be escalated. So I can take a quick look at the comments that are there, and I'm looking at, so it basically says expand some of the acronyms. That's pretty easy. Link to the README, and I guess just a few. And I guess just a few sort of wording comments, I think. So I think there's no, from my perspective, there's no outstanding comments other, sort of no controversial comments, some, code clean, sort of doc cleanup and that kind of comments, but nothing else so far.
Yeah, I think based on this, there might be enough in this to land it as stage 1 and start iterating towards stage 2. Does anyone have any disagreements on that?
None here.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll update based on the latest comments, and then change it to be stage 1. And if people can go in and give their LTGMs, we can look at landing.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for doing that, Michael. That's good.
Thanks.
Now, Michael, a quick question for you on this. And I'm just trying to see who's on the call. So someone from the Node board may be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that the foundation has run a certain level of training for conflict resolution for our current moderation team. Is there anything in this current proposal around trainings or different things that we could be offering both to this code of conduct panel, but the projects themselves?
So the only thing that's in here that refers to training is it actually says the Code of Conduct panel is a cross-foundation team who have been trained in moderation and Code of Conduct issues. And I guess the other thing that maybe relates to your comment is under resources, it does say the CPC will establish a sub-team which will build a set of resources processes that can be reused by projects when implementing their COC processes enforcement. Okay. So there's not specifics in terms of like, we'll provide this or that, but it does at least say that that's something we should be doing.
Okay. I mean, that's something to dig into later, but just something I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I definitely think that should be part of it, is that here are your resources, and that should include like, you know, courses and training like what we have.
Okay, excellent. Anything else that anyone wants to add to this agenda item before we move on to the next one? Okay, excellent. So that takes us through our first section, making pretty good time here. And then this brings us to a section where we're going to discuss different proposals. Some of these proposals are trying to move the phase that they're in. So the first one that we have up here is the CPC charter. It's not looking to move phases right now, but there is a open issue that I opened to change some of the structure of the proposal itself. So currently the CPC charter that was proposed has 3 membership classes: observers, regular members, and voting members. The idea being that any member from the foundation is able to come and participate in the CPC as a observer. Voting members would be members that are capable of voting and are elected on an annual basis by top level projects. And then the third category, regular members. And then Michael, please correct me if I'm wrong, because you drafted this, but the regular members are a group where more or less anyone from any of the projects can raise their hand and be added as a regular member, but there is a higher expectation of commitment for regular members than observers. Well, observers are those who can kind of come and go as they please. Regular members, you know, have expectations for participation, for attendance, and for engagement.
Right. Yeah, and along with that, the wording is that they're responsible along with the voting members for a number of the CPC responsibilities. So observers are just, you know, anybody can come and drop in if they want, but we don't really expect or depend on them for anything. The regular members, we would we expect that they've shown an interest and that they're stepping up to, you know, take some of the responsibility. And it's written so that the voting members have, you know, additional responsibility in certain areas, but whenever possible, it's sort of deferred to be the larger group.
And so this change that I've suggested, it was of my personal opinion that the inclusion of regular members is a little bit complicated in introducing extra process. So by removing it, it allowed us to have the voting members and the observers, but not maintaining a full list. I think one of the things that Michael Dawson and I talked about, but didn't necessarily have consensus on, was what the most inclusive way of moving this forward was. I think for Michael, having the regular members was it was like a straightforward way for people to get involved and include them. Whereas, you know, I was of the feeling that having this list was going to complicate the process or create a bit of a barrier to entry or make people feel like they weren't able to come and attend. I guess we can, another change that had made it into here was that projects, each top level project votes for 2 members, whereas I lowered that to 1. And I think that was the primary difference that was in this change. Does anyone have any thoughts, concerns, or feelings around this?
Yeah, I'll just add my 2 cents is that, yeah, I mean, I think Miles and I had a discussion. We sort of see it in different lights. I see that the regular members lets us give a larger group, hopefully, more of a feeling that they're actually part of the group as opposed to just, dropping in or dropping out, and that actually will add some value, and hopefully, it lets people say that they are there and part of that group, and hopefully makes, I don't know, gives an additional motivation to continue to participate, and we'll see, more people participating through that. In terms of the 1 or 2 members, I 2 was just a matter of flexibility in terms of if you only have 1, it may be harder for projects to select that 1 versus 2. And that's the only thing on that front.
Does
So I
anyone
think
else?
this was, sorry, go ahead.
I'll go for it, Michael.
I was going to say this was just opened not too long, so we haven't had too much time to discuss in the issue itself.
Yeah, so does it make sense perhaps to move on from this agenda item? Because I think there are not as many stakeholders on this call as we would normally have who would be interested in diving into the details on this. Unless
the one observation I'll make from my perspective, having watched a number of these groups form and operate over time, there may be some initial interest in the first one. Once you get to year 2, it's a very small select group who actually cares about driving a lot of this, and so having a complicated or formally locked in process that requires a lot of process around it will, I think, be detrimental to making it a frictionless path forward for some projects. It may be different for Node, but some of the other projects that come in may not be as eager to follow, a whole rigorous set of rules around this. Instead, may have a more preferential way of just moving this forward without having, different classes of voting and regular members and things like that.
Well, I don't think so. I think I think we need at least 2, right? We have the voting members, and I think we also want other people to be able to be involved. So unless we go down to 1, I'm not sure it actually simplifies things that much. And we're talking about either having, like in all cases, you can always, if you just want to be an observer and not go through any process or not do anything, you can still join. The only thing that this PR changes is removing the regular members, where you can kind of be recognized and like you're actually seen to be part of the group versus somebody who might just drop in whenever you want, which you can still do otherwise.
And I guess that was the core of my philosophy here, is that we should make observers feel like they are part of the group, and requiring that second list creates like a bit of a caste system.
So I want to weigh in that I think we maybe need to be thinking about this in terms of the observers are potentially, folks that we want to move down the funnel, so to speak, to becoming, more deeply involved, more engaged, like more active with different, volunteer efforts, because, that's how we keep people from burning out. That's how we keep, the leadership cycling and fresh, and, that sort of thing. So I would want to think about designing the system from a standpoint of helping those folks move from observation to engagement, and helping the people who are engaged feel very satisfied and rewarded for that engagement.
Yeah, and I guess that's the question, what will make them feel satisfied? And does having a stage above observer where you can be on a list and be written as having more responsibilities, is that actually a positive or a negative? Because if it's a negative, we don't want to do it. If it's a positive, maybe we do.
I don't know. That's a good question. I feel like there's probably some research about it that makes me want to go see what I can find personally.
Okay. I have a distinct feeling that we've, gotten a good bit out there. Like just quickly to people who have been on boards before and seen other foundations. Is there any bits of experience that you can add to this, or does it make sense for us to move on to the next agenda item?
I'll just maybe say what I said earlier a little bit different. Simpler is usually easier to engage people.
Yeah, I have to agree with Mike. Simple is the way to go. And then if you want to add complexity on top later, you come up with an exception process to handle it.
Yeah, once you have a bunch of people participating like regular members as you envision here, then you can add that distinction in. But the reality is a lot of people may just pop in and go, and the fact that you're capturing their attention is good enough, and it's up to the CPC, people running the CPC to keep their attention and keep them engaged. So
the other thing I'll just add in is people are motivated in vastly different ways, and we all know that. But titles and permission to do things and access to do things is one way, or a couple of ways, but there are many other ways. So least friction to get involved is also one of the ways people can feel more engaged.
Yeah, agree.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we can move on to the next agenda item, which is expectations. We have 10 minutes to discuss this. We're kind of blasting through agenda items though, so if we need to, we can spend a little bit longer on it. The expectations proposal is one that was put together by Tracy Hines. It was one that was to be brought to the board as essentially the expectations of the foundation by the projects. The biggest bit that needed to be determined for us to get to stage 2 on this was making sure that all of the language was up to date and that we got through the bits that were contentious, which were like kind of the subjective bits, which mentioned like the C3, which is something we decided not to move forward with, and the Node.js having a board seat, which I believe is taken care of by our floating seats that we're discussing right now. So I went ahead and moved this as a proposal to move to stage 2. With that being said, Tracy, who's the champion of this proposal, has not had a chance to review and specifically ask for this. So I guess what I think would make sense for today, what I would like to see happen would just be to hear if there's any objections specifically to moving this to stage 2. And if there are not, then we can, outside of this meeting, probably before next Monday, work to landing it towards stage 2. And for the record, stage 2 being the point where this would move towards the board's review process. And as long as the board has no objections, we could adopt this as official within the repo. Yeah. Has anyone had a chance to read through this in a while, or is this kind of fresh to people at the moment?
It's not fresh, but I certainly don't recall having any issues with it. The last time I saw that it had been updated, has it been updated recently, or is it still basically in that same state?
It's more or less where it had been previously. The biggest thing that I had done was removing the references to things that were contentious before that had mostly been dealt with since we had created this.
Like the C3, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, okay. That sounds fine to me, Miles.
Is there anything else that anyone would like to add right now, or is this something maybe we should kick back to the tracker and bring back next week?
I mean, at this point, it was meant to be advanced feedback to the board, right?
Yeah.
And given where we are in the process, and that they've probably seen it already, and I don't have any objections to landing and considering it done.
Okay. So I guess with that being said, let's document in the issue that no one on the call this week had any problems with this landing at stage 2, and that we can land at a stage 2 out of band between meetings as long as there's no objections this week. Or maybe we just aim to land it next week and give a week. Yeah, let's just do that. Let's land it next week and give a week for people to chime in just in case there's any problems, but kind of consider this mostly done. So the next one that we have up is the individual membership proposal. I believe that there is currently an open issue to move it to stage 1, as well as an open issue to land some text around the individual membership representative. That would be the board director. That is slightly, I guess the way of putting it is it expands upon the currently existing community rep proposal. Is there anyone who's more familiar with the individual membership proposal, especially last week's discussion, who would like to present this?
I certainly don't feel more familiar with it at all, but I'll just say that Tracy presented last week. It was well received, and we did have a great discussion about whether we needed to create the individual membership as a membership class in the bylaws, or whether we could run it as a program, with the group tending to lean toward wanting to run it as a program and then, adopting it into the bylaws on down the road, and kind of per the conversation earlier. That's what I know.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to go, just a quick thought. All these, issues of whether there's bylaw relevance or not, I would leave that as a detail to the end. Just figure out what you want to do. And then when you figure out what you want to do, then we figure out, which piece of paper it goes into, whether it ends up in a charter or within a policy or in the bylaws. But most of all, I'd focus on what it is you're trying to solve and how you want to solve it. And then we'll figure the bylaw bit out later. I don't think it's anything you need to constrain you at this point in time.
I think, Andy, the reason that we've been asking for that sort of gut check is because some of these things will take a lot longer to build consensus on. And so we want to focus on the things that we know will get us to the formation of the joint group as quickly as possible. And then from there, figure out what the things that may be a little more contentious or maybe a little bit longer discussions and not having a substantial impact on the bylaws can be pushed till, once we've formed the group.
Got it. Good point.
So I believe that one of the things with the individual membership that was the most important, and if we want to talk about problem space rather than solution, was we wanted to make sure that that it was set up for success, that it was something that was going to be taken seriously and something that would be, invested in. But I think the other side was making sure that it was something that as a foundation, we had, we were held accountable to this group. And so I know that there's a challenge there from like a legal standpoint within the bylaws, and I won't dig too much into that, not being a lawyer. But Mike, you had discussed that there are ways that we can be held accountable without it necessarily needing to be a membership class. Is that something that you can expand on?
I'm not sure exactly what everybody is referring to when they say accountable, but the results of the foundation, the investments of the foundation, all those things are things that, are pretty, transparently available. And it's something that, the community itself, I don't know what you're trying to achieve by, voting, because for those who have participated in these things and been on boards and been a part of the various constituencies within a community construct, where things usually happen are things like the CPC or at the project TSC level. it very rarely is a board voting, in a part of it, because in effect, most board decisions are consensus anyways. I can't think of hardly any, board votes at the node level, for example, that were not complete consensus. So, in that construct, where your accountability is generally to push it down into the community itself in terms of the process, the policies, the charters for the various groups. And so where you want accountability should rest in, the actual execution arm of who's actually going to be making decisions and doing the actual work that derives the outcome you're expecting. Does that make sense?
I think from my perspective, that's not the accountability or the concern that was being raised, at least the way I've heard it. Because either way, like whether it's run as a program or run as chartered in the bylaws or whatever you would call it, I think we're talking about board representation. So I don't think that's the difference. I think the difference that maybe I'm reading in between the lines is that if it's actually part of the bylaws, it's harder to ignore. It's written into the bylaws that you will have this program and you will run this program. Whereas if it's a program, it could be more easily ignored, forgotten about, that kind of stuff. So I think it was a feeling that it makes it more, it makes it more, maybe more credible, and there's some feeling that you'll get better accountability because it's written in formally as opposed to being something that's not formally there.
I don't know that really changes it. I mean, like how will that affect a different change? I guess that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, I'm actually happy either way, but that's the concern, I think.
It's just a matter of, I think the challenge is you have to think through like the next steps. Like, just putting somebody on a board doesn't necessarily, one, do any of those people, actually represent the broader community interest.
But we're not talking about a board seat or not. I think we're talking about the current discussion seems to be around, does it need to be in the bylaw? Like, do
as a
individual
membership
members,
class?
Yes, as a membership class. Sorry,
and that's where you get to what are you actually going to affect in the bylaws? And to Andy's point earlier, does it actually appropriately belong in the bylaws or somewhere else, like in a charter for an individual membership program? Because there may be more reflective of the reality. The reality is if you go try to make a change and let's say you have to get a vote of all the membership classes or something along those lines, like now you're into hunting down individuals who may not care, may have gone away, just aren't responding to email anymore. The logistics of certain things may be more complicated. I don't know what that really gets anyone to have.
I'm just playing devil's advocate to represent, what I think I've heard people. But for example, if it did require a vote of the membership to disband the individual membership program, that's a case where that being there, I don't know if it's accountability, but it means that it's not something that can be, not done as easily.
I guess building on what you just said, though.
But that can be written into the individual membership program charter again. It doesn't have to be a membership class in the bylaws. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like I'm 100%. Like I think in my mind, the key decision we should make at this point is, does it need to be part of the bylaws or not? My personal view is, I don't think it does. But I think we need to, when Miles mentioned accountability, I think it was coming from if it's not a membership class, maybe that somehow leads to less accountability in terms of paying attention or running the program or something like that.
But that seems to me now, like with the way in which Mike is putting it, that it being chartered would likely, have the exact same effect as the CPC. And if being chartered is sufficient for the CPC to feel like it has autonomy and responsibility, and that the board is also accountable for its success, a charter of an individual membership program seems like it should have the same effect.
Right. I mean, that makes sense to me. So I think maybe we should just put that like make that proposal that this is the way we think it's best to be done. And, you know, this is why it's just as good as the other case and better because it doesn't have the, you know, it doesn't have these complications. Because I think that's if we made that decision, that would clarify what it does or doesn't need to go into the bylaws. I guess in this case, it would be a charter, you know, it would be that it would be chartered as opposed to being a membership class, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Andy, I mean, my thoughts are, you know, having a membership class that's, you know, nominal in nature, has really no rights or benefits or anything like that. And then, you know, it's just there and it's a few thousand people and you have to track all the members of that class and treat them accordingly on, I don't know what. It just seems to be more complication and headache and not really actually achieving anything. But, you know, is there something I'm missing in terms of what the membership class would get somebody?
Yeah, this is Andy. Let me just sort of clarify. The bylaws are a legal document with constraints that come out of Delaware law, and those constraints are actually pretty narrow. There's not a lot that has to be in the bylaws. If there's a membership class that has any voting rights relating to the organization as a whole, which usually means electing a director or directors, or having the right to specific participation rights. Usually that's mostly members, but the only thing you really have to have in your bylaws is who can vote for the board. After that, it's kind of up to you how much you want to put in the directors. So I take your point about perceptions. You know, certainly it can make a difference that people may think, I feel safer because I see this in the bylaws, because the bylaws have a perception of being, you know, more static, that they're not the kind of thing that can easily be changed. The reality, though, is that anything can be changed as easily as anything else, whether it's in the bylaws or not. So anything that exists outside of the bylaws requires a board vote. Anything that's inside the bylaws requires a board vote. So unless you add a provision that says this particular change requires a supermajority, it's easy to change every single thing about the organization, whether or not it's in the bylaws. So I think Mike's right that as a generality, the less you have in the bylaws, the better. But, you know, if there's a strong community feeling that they'll just feel better to see something in there, you do have the freedom to do that if you decide that there's a good reason to do it.
Right. Well, I think like based on the proposal, we'll need something because it talks about there being a board member being activated, right? So I don't know whether that goes in the bylaws, but somewhere in the governance, that's
if you would have the right to have a director, there needs to be at least a mention in the bylaws. I mean, for example, just to give an obvious example, you could say no more than that the TSC shall have a board seat elected in the manner determined by the TSC. You know, so one sentence. Or you could put more detail in there about how that board seat is elected. But other than board seats, or other voting rights, which I wouldn't suggest, like having members be able to vote to approve amendments to the bylaws. You know, you can do it. You can do all those things outside the bylaws.
Yeah, and that's where I think what I'm suggesting is actually closer, you know, along the lines of what we would put in for the CPC representative and things like that, Michael, versus, you know, establishing the CPC as a membership class in the actual entity itself.
Yeah, I think, you know, and that's what makes sense to me. I think just like that's the remaining part that, you know, as Sarah was mentioning, we want to figure out what the impact is. If we had consensus that was the way to go, that would probably be all that was needed in terms of the bylaws, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus a membership class. And I think it only came up, like I didn't even, you know, I think some people were surprised that individual members were actually a special class, but it's, you know, since they are now, I think that's why the discussion is happening.
I guess kind of building on this, and Andy and Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm just kind of glossing through the current bylaws of the Node Foundation. And for the most part, you know, there's mentions of the TSC around specifically around the election of that director, and vacancies of the board. Then there's also just one mention in committee of members. So it just talks about like the foundation of the TSC and the fact that the TSC itself, like how it's funded and that it's chartered. Would that perhaps be something that could be along the lines of like a compromise that might make everyone happy, in which like the chartering of an individual membership itself could be in the bylaws, but not as a membership class, but rather as a chartered program? And just kind of thinking through this would then make it so that there's, I think, that accountability of it being in the bylaws, but that if there ever needs to be any changes to the program, it's not requiring all the membership classes to make changes, but rather just the board.
Well, everything is, the default is that unless the bylaws provide otherwise, the board can do everything.
Yeah.
So you don't have to state what the board can do. You only have to state what the board can't do, that members have the right to do instead. And you know, we can put in some general enablement language, you know, that might be helpful. I mean, for example, if you look at the Linux Foundation bylaws, you'll see that there's a section that says the board may from time to time create such non-membership classes as it may deem to be appropriate. You know, so if you wanted to, you could put a placeholder in there if that makes people feel better. It doesn't mean that anything exists today, but it means that you can point to people and say, hey, look, you know, if we need it, it's right there in the bylaws. We can do this in the future.
Okay, excellent. I think that we had 15 minutes planned for this last agenda item, and we've kind of gone over on this one around the individual membership. Does it make sense for us to perhaps move to the issue and maybe try to document some of these expectations or bits that we need to discuss in that stage 1 pull request, and revisit this next week? Does anyone object to that?
Nope.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for chiming in on that. The last one that we have here is Jory's proposal on project progression, which does have an open PR to move it to stage 2. Jory, would you like to lead the discussion on this one?
Surely. So this brings the project progression proposal a little bit, hopefully closer to a place where we can adopt it. The big changes in this particular piece include the incorporation of some open governance requirements, and you can see also that there's an issue linked that just sort of raised that. But this would bring some structural requirements to what we have been calling top-level projects to ensure that they're truly open projects. And that was iterated on via meeting and via issue with a lot of people, and I think we're getting to a place where we like that. There are still some outstanding things that I think would make some community members feel a bit more confident, which would include bringing in some more explicit metrics around what kinds of projects we're looking for via their proposal process. And I think I've got some ideas that I'd like to brainstorm with a couple of folks to address those concerns, but relying on existing measurement tools and stuff like that. So I feel like that's in a good place, or will be in a good place soon. The other major shift that this brings into play is an update to what we had been calling let's see, sandbox, incubation, and top level, which were terms that we were relying on because they were borrowed from, I think, the CNCF, but I think a lot of folks myself included, were not quite comfortable with this idea of hierarchically kind of defining these stages. And so the proposal has renamed those to more accurately, I think, reflect the objective of that given stage. So we have at-large, we have growth, and we have impact projects. And then emeritus projects are projects that we feel have reached end of life. And for each of those stages, you can read through and see that there's some definition of that stage, some examples of the kinds of characteristics you might find in a project of that stage, and the requirements that a project might need to meet in order to reach the next stage. With the idea being that there's a review process orchestrated by the CPC that assesses whether projects are truly in the correct stage and can move back and forth as they mature or phase in and out of different, periods. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And super excited to hear what you guys have to say about it.
I definitely like the new names, so I'm a super fan of those.
Thanks.
I think it's moving in a really great direction. I think that, and I think this is going to be true of a handful of these proposals that we have, that it's not really going to be until we start trying to do it that we find out where the edge cases are on this. Like, it's really easy to design in a vacuum. So, I think that one thing that might be worth documenting in here, although apologies if it already is just making it really clear that this process is malleable for the first bit of time. That is something that we're going to be figuring out through a certain degree of trial and error. I think that's something that's going to be really important to kind of set the stage so that we don't get too caught up on all of the specifics.
I'm not sure that belongs in the documents though, as landed, right? In your governance
could be in the README.
Yeah, sure. I could see it definitely in the README, and I think as we communicate things, that's a very good message in terms of, well, here's what we think will work, but things will likely change. I don't know if you want that in the thing that says what we're going to do, though. That's all.
Oh, no, and to be clear, I'm talking just about documenting it somewhere, and I think the README is the right place to do it.
Okay.
There's something that we have historically and something that we can point to, and I feel like that could kind of diffuse any stop energy that may come around trying to perfect this.
Yeah, no, README totally makes sense to me.
The only other thing I'm curious about, Jory, and I didn't see it in here, and perhaps this is like a different proposal or an appendum, is we're going to have a base of projects that already exist, and we're going to have to try to figure out where they end up living.
Yep.
Has that been documented at all yet, or is that, do you view that as a separate proposal or perhaps a secondary document within this proposal?
So I'll just sort of explain kind of how I've imagined this proceeding. So obviously, part of as a member of the JSF TAC, it's really important to me that the document that we're authoring is reflective of the project needs and their concerns, and that they can identify with where they would like to be on this particular proposal. That's been a sub goal of mine the entire time. So I would like to believe that at this point, the projects are in a good place where they can self-identify that I believe my project will be an emeritus project or an at-large project, or whatever the case may be. I would like to, as a matter of process for this first year, allow them to self-select into the stage. And we have this CPC review process that we will create, hopefully, soon as we have a CPC that can and we can leverage the review process to make any adjustments. But I think it would be most beneficial to allow them at this point to see the stages, choose for themselves which ones they think is the best fit, and then allow the process to take over from there.
Now, is that for everything except for impact, or including impact, or like what if everybody said, hey, we're in the impact stage?
That is really not going to happen, but
just curious.
but yes, I think so. I think it should be. That's my perspective.
Excellent. So Joy, what are the next steps that you see we should do here?
So I'd love to land this as stage 2 with everyone's consent. And then there were a couple of things that were called out on the PR to kind of refine a little bit, obviously update the README. Also at this stage, if it is selected to move to stage 2, I would probably start up like a poll of some kind for the projects to start doing that self-selection, so we can start to imagine where they fit, and that could be part of, you know, the stage 3 PR is identifying where our existing projects and resources are going to come in, because I think stage 3 is the last stage, right?
Yes. So just to go over it one more time, at least the way in which it was intended was that when something moves to stage 2, that means that it has more or less 100% consensus within the technical projects and the foundation, and like the projects within the 2 foundations, to move forward towards the boards for the board to review and give any feedback. And stage 3 would then mean it's adopted.
Groovy.
So when was, I'm just double checking when it was open to move to stage 2. So it was opened about a week ago. I see some comments on here. Jory, would you be comfortable leaving it open for one more week to have those comments reviewed, or do you think that there's been sufficient review time?
I absolutely comfortable with it being open for another, you know, week or so, or even 2. I want, you know, everybody to feel good about this. So totally happy to do that. So leave it open.
Okay.
And Jory, did you plan to fill out the annual review section at some point? Or
yeah, I think I want to brainstorm with some folks on how to make that just a little bit more because I think the CPC needs to create that review process, and so I think it needs to be fleshed out more, but not so much more that the team who assembles, the CPC who assembles, can't make changes. So
yeah, I was thinking you could even just put something in for now, just to allow it to progress, is to say that, you know, the CPC will be responsible for you know, setting a program around doing an annual review or something like that.
That's what it says, I think.
Oh, mine just says TBD, but maybe I'm looking at
an
an
you're
old
looking
version.
at the, I think you're looking at the old
oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the old
current
version.
one basically says they will put one in, put one in place.
Okay, I'm looking at the old one, sorry.
That's okay.
Which I think I agree with Jory, and like, you know, that's probably enough until the CPC comes together, and if it makes sense to put more details in this, which I guess is maybe not part of the charter even, so, you know, it should be easy to add details if that makes sense.
Okay. So we've got 1 minute left. I think, Jory, are you happy with the action item of giving it another week, and then, you know, if there's no outstanding objections, landing it in the next meeting?
Yep.
Excellent. And then I guess the only note we had there was adding something to the README, but I can give some suggested text on that as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got 1 minute left. Is there any hanging questions, thoughts, or concerns before we close out the meeting? Okay, well, thank you, everyone. It's exciting. It feels like we're really close on all of this. So it's you know, great to see a lot of this wrapping up, and I look forward to next week's meeting. Have a great week, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Talk to you then. Bye.
Bye.